Techniques we discuss here are meant for licensed wildlife professionals. If you aren't licensed and trained for wildlife rehabilitation, do not attempt to capture, hold, or rehabilitate any wild animal. If you find an injured wild animal, a wildlife professional can recommend next steps. Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation, Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buell. We'll tackle topics about rescue, care, management, reconditioning, and releasing wildlife found in North America. This is a deep dive into each subject. We hope to give rehabilitators information they can use because they're already going to great lengths to rescue and nurse animals back to health. An injured or orphaned wild animal's journey to restored health and independence in their natural habitat is delicate and complex. We draw techniques and expertise from many disciplines. Many animals brought into rehabilitation cannot be saved. The last gift we can give them is humane euthanasia. We will talk more about when this is necessary. Sometimes animals are deemed non-releasable and evaluated to be suitable for a life in captivity. When that happens, we shift to a long-term approach to managing their care, training, and housing. Some such animals serve as ambassador animals, a term for the animals that rehabilitators use to educate the public. Each episode will speak with experts who represent specialty topics across the profession of wildlife rehabilitation, ambassador animal care and management, showcasing best practices. Welcome back. This is the second part of my in-depth discussion with my go-to Raptor reconditioning expert, Lori Arent. Lori is the Assistant Director at the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota. If you're just joining us, Lori and I centered our conversation around Creance flying, a type of reconditioning for raptors to get them back to the wild to be the Olympic athletes that they are. In this episode, we'll talk about how Lori's education background, skills, and experiences, including falconry, shaped her thoughts around reconditioning. For Lori and the Raptor Center, this naturally led to a scientific study on the role of lactic acid in the body for building stamina and muscles. I learned a lot in this conversation about muscles and getting fit, whether you're a raptor or a human. All of those things kind of rolled into one that started getting you down a very scientific path on figuring out how to do this reconditioning effectively so we know that these animals are ready to go back to the wild.
Right, so it kind of started just subjectively. You know, we would put these birds on a creance, which, as you pointed out, is basically a long tether. Mm-hmm. And we would give them opportunities to fly, to build their muscles, as well as their cardiovascular endurance. And then we would just look at them and go, yeah, you know, I think they're probably good enough to go. And that always just nagged at me a little bit, you know. Mm-hmm. And so at the time, Dr. Gary Duke had a postdoc student, Dr. Susan Chaplin, who was also very interested in physiology. And so she kind of led the charge in doing a study where we measured the amount of blood lactate that was produced in the blood following exercise. And this was a study that was based off what at that time was being done in racehorses to measure their level of fitness during their conditioning program for races. Mm-hmm. And so basically what it entailed is that we would fly on a creance, we'd exercise our birds, a standard amount that we kind of had decided that was pretty typical. And then we would measure the amount of blood lactic acid at 2 minutes and 10 minutes after their last flight on a creance. And of course, there were times when we were doing this in the winter, so we learned how to take blood samples with frozen fingers, which was, you know, really interesting.
I helped with this a little bit, and I remember taking blood in the field in the middle of the wintertime.
Right. Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
So what happens is when a raptor is not well conditioned, it starts to produce lactic acid in the blood. And that basically means that its cardiovascular system is not able to supply its working muscles with sufficient oxygen. And so what happens is lactic acid is produced, and of course, lactic acid will then lead to muscle fatigue. Mm-hmm. And so we weren't sure though, well, how do we know how much lactic acid is normal in these birds? And so fortunately, we had a wonderful group of local falconers who allowed us to put some of their birds in the middle of the season. And that is why it had to be in the winter, because it was in the middle of the hunting season, which for falconry pretty much mimics the small animal, the small game hunting season. So it's like September 1st to the end of February in Minnesota. And so we put their birds, and we started with red-tailed hawks. So I think we had like 10 falconers who let us, quote unquote, borrow their red-tailed hawks and put them through our exercise program on a Creance. And then we would measure their blood lactate at 2 minutes and 10 minutes post-exercise, just like we would our patients. And to us, those birds resembled the level of fitness that we would like to have for our patients to have when released, because they were in the middle of their hunting season. You know, they were extremely active. To us, they were as close as we could get to, you know, trapping a wild bird and putting it through the program, right?
Right.
So we used those birds and the data as controls.
Okay, we have to have another shout out to falconers here.
Oh, definitely.
Talk about helping get these other wild raptors back and contributing. So, wow, awesome.
Yeah. And so what we basically found from that is that when we were subjectively looking at the birds, you know, looking at their flight distance and their breathing pattern and all that, we were pretty much spot on with what their physiology was telling us. So that really helped to solidify the exercise program, and it made it more formal, you know. So now we knew, okay, for medium-sized raptors, this is the total distance they need to fly in order to, you know, be considered to be ready for release. And of course, with that, you know, would be things like they have to have normal mechanics in addition to being able to fly a certain distance. And they should be able to fly that distance during several flight sessions, not just a one and done.
Right. Wow. So the falconers contributed the red-tailed hawks. Was it the birds at the Raptor Center that you were trying to recondition, were they all red-tailed hawks too? I mean, you said medium raptors, but I know that there's large and there's small and all this kind of stuff. So how was that? Were you able to make it apples to apples?
Yeah, so I mean, we wanted to make it apples to apples, and that's why we tested the falconry red-tails to get the controls. And then we also tested, in addition to red-tailed hawk patients, great horned owl patients and barred owl patients, so similar size. And as it turns out, their lactic acid values were very similar to the red-tails, which we found to be very interesting, with the same protocol. You know, we'd have them fly the same total distance during their flight, and that was sufficient to get them in shape as well, which kind of surprised me, actually, because red-tailed hawks being diurnal, you know, they fly a little bit more than a great horned or barred owl would, but at the end of the day, the same reconditioning efforts needed for red-tailed hawks were the same as what was needed for great horns and barred owls.
You're right. That is very interesting, because we're talking about diurnal, nocturnal. Owl feathers are very different. Their flight and hunting styles tend to be very different than diurnals or daytime raptors. So I find that also very interesting that a lot of the same things are happening in their body. The same physiology is happening in their body to whether they're tiring out their muscles or they're in really good condition. So I know that part of what you use to also help with this whole program is using sports physiology. And I don't know if that tied it all together, or you took a look at those principles and fit them in, or how did that work?
Well, that kind of came after a little bit.
Okay.
When I started, you know, really just wanting to investigate exercise in general more. Now, I must admit, I'm not one that goes to the gym on a regular basis or does weightlifting or anything like that. So my knowledge was pretty, you know, slim. But, you know, what I found is that there are 5 basic principles to exercise. And that exercise will help to build muscle. So it's the type of exercise like if you are trying to ramp up to do a marathon, right? And to me, reconditioning these birds is like preparing them for a race. They have to beat their prey, right? Basically.
Right.
And if
Olympic
they don't,
athletes.
exactly. And some of them have to migrate hundreds to thousands of miles, right? So want to make sure that they're going to be in tip-top shape. So when I started looking at what they say the 5 basic principles of exercise are for humans, I could really relate that those would very much so be the same principles that could be applied and should be applied when reconditioning raptors.
So you took falconry, you're taking human physiology and certainly science to show how this all ties in together and how we can get these animals back out into the wild in tip-top condition, right? Olympic athletes, like I mentioned. So anything else that comes to mind that kind of was put in this pot and mixed all together to get this conditioning program going?
Well, Creance flying obviously takes a little bit more effort, more resources than those birds that are exercised in a pen, in a flight pen situation. And so there was a lot of training that had to happen. We needed to recruit a whole new group of volunteers, get them well trained in the technique. And so what kind of came from that was like a 30-page spiral-bound manual on the Creance technique that I would then share with the volunteers. They'd have to read it. They'd have to take little tests on it. They'd go through hands-on training before they would be independent. And so whenever you Creance a bird, it's always done in pairs. It should always be done with 2 people. One person to handle the bird and the other person to handle the Creance or the line. And then the person who's handling the bird is the one that really should be observing the flight, because as a line handler, your main focus is to make sure that bird is safe as it's in the air, right? I don't know if you're close to trees or whatever, you want to make sure the bird doesn't get in a tree. If it's, depending where your flight space is, if it's close to a road, you want to make sure that, the bird doesn't get there. And so if you're doing the line, at least I find it very difficult to also be evaluating the bird's flight. So we kind of say, okay, once you put the bird in the air, so either down on the ground or a light toss, you then, as the bird handler, should be monitoring and evaluating the flight.
Okay, well, that makes sense, and it gives a little bit better, clearer picture. So from that, I do know from that 30-page manual, it got, because there was so much interest in it, in the past few years, you completed another publication for Creance flying. Do you want to tell everybody what that's about?
Sure. So, that 30-page internal spiral-bound resource, all of a sudden it ended up, and I don't even know how this happened, like Beautyo Books had it, they were selling it, and it's like, oh my gosh. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, it was intended as a volunteer resource,
right.
not to be distributed widely. So I decided that it needed to be more robust if it was going outside the Raptor Center. So it took me quite a while, but I did create a digital resource, which is now available, which is 100 pages. And then there's also 2 addendums to it. One is a series of videos for owls showing really good flight in owls and talking about the mechanics and things that you need to look for when these owls are on a Creance. And the other one has the diurnal birds. So there's
awesome.
Like 23 different species that are covered in these 2 separate video packages. And then there's also a group of videos that are in the Creance manual book itself on how to do the technique. So, and I think we're going to be talking about this stuff. So yes. There are videos like how to put on jesses and how to retrieve a bird when it's at the end of the line, just so people can get a visual on that too, because it's really difficult just explaining it, right? And I'm a person who I like to see things, and then it makes more sense. So I also wanted the people who purchased this to be able to see things and not just read them.
Exactly. And we will make sure that we have a link, and maybe we might be able to get a little video clip or something to share with people so they can kind of do the same thing, just see it. It's not for training them, but just so they kind of understand a little bit better what we're talking about when we're talking about Creance flying. So, oh my gosh, that's a wonderful resource for a lot of people. And with now technology, that's also helped with the videos and having it in ebook. Wow. Amazing. Amazing how far we've come. Although having those visual resources and right there is invaluable. Absolutely invaluable for learning new techniques. In general, we've got, well, not even in general, you've given a lot of specifics. There's falconry involved. There's lots of scientific principles involved. There's the sports physiology, which also draws on the scientific principles and everything, all mixed together. Then putting it together in a program, in a volunteer program that has evolved over the years, which many things do, into a resource for so many other people to help them with their raptors. I think that this has been just a wonderful conversation on kind of that background, that this didn't just appear in the raptor rehabilitation world, that it was developed and there's a lot of background to it. Thank you so much for listening. In the next and final segment of my talk with Lori Arent, we dive into the specifics of Creance flying as a craft. We cover equipment, techniques, species differences, and resources for those of you who want to learn even more. Lori brings a huge wealth of knowledge and experience to the table, so I hope you'll stay tuned for episode 12. This was another episode of Wildlife Rehabilitation Rescue to Release. We're glad you joined us today. Wildlife Rehabilitation Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buell. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. Our producer is Kirk Clucky. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit raptor.umn.edu. Are you interested in becoming a licensed wildlife rehabilitator? Visit the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association website at nwrawildlife.org for resources to get started. And remember, if you do find an injured or orphaned animal, please contact a licensed wildlife rehabilitator in your area. And that's our show. Hope you'll join us next time.